All right, good evening. We are happy to see everybody. We've got a nice little crowd with us tonight, and we're happy for that. I want to kind of continue, in a sense, with what we were talking about last Sunday evening. And I got to thinking about these things after Bible class this morning. And just some of the things that Clinton had to say and that John had to say, and an example that he brought up. And I want to ask the question, do we have false teachers in the church today? Yes, without a doubt. We have false teachers in the church today. In our lesson last week, we was talking about congregation in Tennessee, and once again, I'm not going to say where this was for very obvious reasons, but if you want to know, more than happy to tell you privately. A hiring of a female to be a preaching intern. And like we shared with you last week, there's absolutely nothing wrong with a preaching intern. That's how I started out 37 years ago, was as a preaching intern. But they hired a female, hired a young girl to fulfill or to fill that position. And the preacher, when he got up on that particular Sunday morning, whether it was in a sermon or in some type of statement, and he said that this was a movement that has long been coming. Was he holding true to what was being taught in the New Testament? Was he holding true to what was taught in 1 Corinthians 14? Or what is taught in 1 Timothy chapter 2? No. And so that very simply makes him a false teacher, doesn't it? Especially in that particular thing. Now, by the way, let me just add here, in case you were thinking from Bible class this morning that he just get up and did this on his own, that he hired this young lady on his own. No. The elders were fully behind that particular decision and was simply making a statement or preaching a lesson so that the congregation would also be behind that. John in his comments this morning talked about a Church of Christ minister who was an author. And just like that of John, I've read several of his books. And he is a very good author. He has a lot of good things to say, but he always stops short. He never goes far enough. In fact, today he has gone in the opposite direction, has taken the congregation that he works for in the opposite direction, and has affected the lives of many members of the Lord's church, taking them in the opposite direction. Now, I've thought a lot about that this afternoon, and I believe, friends, that also makes him a false teacher. And the fact that he falls short and is leading people in the opposite way. And it's sad to say that we do have false teachers in the Lord's church. But yet, didn't we know that this was going to happen? Well, I think so. How does Christ refer to false teachers in the gospel? How does he refer to them? Okay, wolves or in sheep's clothing. He refers to him as how? As ravening wolves in sheep's clothing. That is found in Matthew, the 7th chapter. Now let's just stop and think here for a minute. What is meant here? And he does refer to them as ravening wolves. What is meant here by that term? Ravening wolves. A wolf that is ravening is what? Well, he's ravenous.
Vicious.
Huh?
Vicious.
He's vicious. He's destroying. What else is it? Well, the phrase ravening in the language New Testament means to be extremely hungry. Now, I thought about that this afternoon as I was reading that and studying that. He's extremely hungry. Okay, he's hungry for what?
Glory.
He's hungry for glory. He's hungry for what? He's hungry for a lot of things. Glory is part of it. He's hungry for position, but he is also hungry for you and I. He's hungry and wants to lead us in a different direction. I want to talk about Matthew chapter 7. Let's just study that passage for just a little bit here tonight. Matthew chapter 7. And let's begin reading. We're going to read several verses here, but let's begin reading in verse 15. And let's study this passage together, and let's see what we can come to the understanding of. There, beginning in verse 17, Jesus said this. He said, "Beware of false prophets." Now, by the way, who is he speaking to? Well, if you know this passage very well, then we know it's the Sermon on the Mount. And so we might think, well, he's speaking to the whole multitude. Well, we turn to Luke chapter 6, and we find out he's actually speaking, at this point at least, to his disciples. But he says it, I believe, so that all of the multitude can hear. And so he said, first of all, beware of false prophets. Now, what is meant here, do you think, by beware? Okay, to watch out for. To watch out for. Anybody else?
Be careful of.
Okay, be careful of. Okay, be cautious of. Janet's absolutely right in her meaning. Watch out for. That word beware in the language New Testament means to turn your mind to or pay attention to. Pay attention to. Be cautious of. All right. Why is he telling us to pay attention to false prophets? Why is he telling us to pay attention to them? Is he telling us we need to be listening to what they have to say and follow them?
No, we're pay attention to them so you will know that by their words that they are false prophets.
Okay.
And you'll want to avoid that person.
Okay. All right, so pay attention to them so that you can see that here is one who is a false prophet.
But they come in looking real nice.
Okay. All right. Okay. They come in looking real nice. We'll get to that here in just a minute. And so he tells them to pay attention to. Did he tell them to pay attention to true prophets? Not in the way that he's meaning here. Now, let's ask this question. What is a true prophet? Now, by a true prophet, what I mean is, what is a biblical prophet?
Proclaimer of God's word.
Okay. That's in the general area. Anybody else? What is a biblical prophet? Well, a biblical prophet is someone who speaks for who? God. He speaks for God to who? To people. And so a biblical prophet is one who speaks for God to the people, and he speaks whose words? God's words. The words that God has given him. And so we're not talking here about biblical prophets, but rather he tells them to turn their attention to what type of prophet? A false prophet. Anybody know what false prophet means in the original language? Okay, it means untrue. It means someone who is simply acting the part. He's acting the part. He is a religious imposter. Brother H. Leo Bowles, in his comment on false prophets, says that a false prophet is someone who acts as if he is a spokesperson for God, but God never put his words in his mouth nor in his heart. He is simply playing a part, playing the part of a prophet. And so Jesus says here, well, you've got to be cautious of them. Pay attention for them. Be aware that they are out there and look for them. Now, why does Jesus go on to say here that we need to pay attention for these false prophets?
You need to know your enemy as you know yourself.
Okay.
You need to know what kind of message they're putting out there, we need to battle against.
Okay. All right. Dave, you said something a little bit ago. Remember what it was?
They come in looking like they're okay. They come in
Okay.
real nice.
Okay, they come in looking real nice. Okay. They come in looking real nice. They come in, Jesus said, dressed as what?
Sheep.
As sheep. Now, why do they come in? What is meant here, first of all, by the sheep? Okay. Children of God. They come in dressed like one of the flock. Now, why do they do that?
They don't want you to get suspicious.
Okay, they don't want you to get suspicious. All right, so Dave said they come in and they look real good. They look real nice. They come in looking that way so that when we see that person, we'll think, well, they're all right. Okay, they usually sound pretty good to start off, don't they? And so they come in and they look like they're humble, they look like they're meek, they look like someone that we can be safe around. Okay, say that again. Okay, they want your attention. Okay, they want the attention of people so that they can eventually lead them astray. Does that happen overnight? In fact, the very best of false teachers will take a long time to gain people's confidence.
They want to become like EFO.
Okay? Everybody listens. Okay, everybody listens. Everybody listens. And I'll tell you what, especially the example that John shared with us this morning, and we're not going to tell you his name openly. If you want to know who it is, we'll tell you privately. But when people speak this man's name, they listen. I was listening to the radio just the other day, and was listening to my family will tell you I listen to the talk stations, and there was one of the talk shows that had this particular man on it, and he was just singing the praise of this man, and he talks about how everybody just thinks he is fantastic, and he has a lot of good ideas that are right. And when people hear his name, they think, boy, we got to listen to what he has to say. Well, he built that up over time. And false teachers do the same thing. You know, I'm mindful of a preacher that was hired by a congregation of the Lord's church in a different state. And he came in and he worked for them for 2 or 3 years. And then they started to wonder, okay, how can we build up our number? How can we build up our number? Now, if you and I, we were talking about building up our number, what would be the answer to that question? We got to go teach people, right? We got to go teach people. But instead of doing that approach, he says, well, We want to add people to our number. We need to have 2 services, which they didn't have the people for 2 services to begin with, but we need to have 2 services, and in the second service, we need to have instruments. So there it started. Was there for 2 or 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. Not really sure how long he was there. But eventually, this was brought out. And eventually, after a while, he said, well, let's just go from 1 service or 2 services to 1 service and have instruments. And it cost half of the congregation. And so it doesn't happen overnight. It takes some time in order for it to happen. Takes some time. Go ahead.
And we sat here and say, well, that could not happen. And I want to tell you, we need to be careful because it could happen.
It could happen. And I'm sure that the member, that congregation, they probably said the same time, well, it'll never happen here. But yet it was gradually brought in, and then it destroyed a congregation, and they still haven't recovered. Go ahead.
Peter says they bring it in secretly.
Yeah. Yeah, bring them in secretly.
That's the same way the Crossroads movement would move in. You
Okay.
start working through the young people.
Start working through the young people. Start having, little group discussions and things of this nature, and before you know it, they're all going down the wrong path. And so, go ahead.
And this was in the Old Testament, the same thing happened in the Old Testament.
Okay.
And God, here in Jeremiah 14:14, the Lord said to me, Jeremiah, these prophets are telling lies in my name. I did not send them.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Telling lies in my name. I did not send them. And so it takes time. And they're simply waiting for people to get comfortable with them. Every time I think of this passage or study this passage, I think that old cartoon, Warner Brothers cartoon of the coyote and the sheepdog. We've all seen it, right? The coyote and the sheepdog. Sheepdog sits up on a hill, and he's watching over the flock, and the coyote tries different things to grab one of the sheep. And almost in every single episode of that series, he eventually puts on a sheep costume. And he makes his way slowly out into the middle of the flock, and he stands there until they get comfortable with him, and then he grabs one of the sheep. He looked humble, he looked meek, he looked like one of the sheep, and then he grabs one. Right? He waited until they were comfortable with him. Now, of course, we all know that once he got the sheep back to his lair, he stood up on his hind legs, he unzipped and outstepped the coyote. The sheep that was taken stood up on its hind legs, unzipped, and there was the sheepdog. Okay, all right, well, you can certainly make that comparison, can't you? But he waited until the flock felt comfortable, and then he reached out and he grabbed them. And that's exactly what happens with false teachers today. He reaches out and he grabs them.
Lots of times they start with 1 or 2, the newer members.
Yeah. Why is that? Why do they start with the younger members?
They're easier to sway.
Okay, they're easier to sway. They're easier to sway. And so he'll start in that way. And he'll sway them and eventually take them away. And so we've got to ask ourselves the question, how can we recognize false teachers? Jesus wants us to pay attention. Jesus wants us to watch for them. Jesus wants us to be cautious of them. And so how can we identify them?
We need to know the word.
Ah, what an idea that is. We need to know the Word. Now remind me of that. We're going to come back to that. Jesus gives us an answer here in chapter 7, doesn't he? How do we know a false teacher? Okay, by their fruits. By their fruits. In fact, he tells us how many times? Once? Three times? I know that's two. Isn't it 16 and 20? Is there another one in between there? Verse 16, it says, and you shall know them by their fruits. Again in verse 20, wherefore by their fruits ye shall know them. Them is referring back to the false teacher or the false prophets. You shall know them by their fruits. Okay. The word fruit here, both in 16 and 20, comes from the Greek word karpos, and it can either be literally or figurative. Okay? Of course, fruits literally would be what? Fruit off of a tree, fruit off of a vine, fruit off, Okay, what Adam and Eve ate. It would literally be fruit. So, are we talking literally here?
We're talking about their actions.
We're talking figuratively. We're talking about their actions. And the word karpos means act, it means work, it means deeds. And so we'll know them by their deeds. Know them by their deeds. Once again, I'm going to ask the question, we're going to know right away.
No.
It's going to take a while. It's going to take a while. I was reminded of a conversation that I had with my father-in-law last weekend. We were standing up on Andrew's property, watching Andrew work. We were standing up on Andrew's property. And if you've ever been up there, then you know his house is surrounded by woods and all kind of trees and things. And they were down in the one wooded section of his property. And we were standing there, we were looking, and my father-in-law and I were having a conversation. In the midst of that conversation, he said, I used to be able to tell the difference between all of these trees, but he says, I can't do it anymore. He said, anymore, they all look the same. We need to know that false teacher is going to look just like you and I. By that I mean they're going to come in and they're going to live like you and I to begin with. They're going to look like you and I. They're going to look humble, and they're going to look meek, and they're going to look like somebody who we can be safe with. But Jesus here is saying eventually their actions, their deeds are going to reveal who they truly are. It's going to reveal who they truly are. Why is that?
You can only hide your true self for so long,
Okay.
and then it's gonna surface.
Okay.
As a man thinketh, so is he.
As a man thinketh, so is it. We're only going to be able to hide our true self for so long. Can a good tree produce bad fruit? No. Can a bad tree produce good fruit? No. In fact, the word that is used here is the word corrupt, right? A corrupt tree, verse 16, verse 17, right around in there. A corrupt tree. What is meant by corrupt? Actually means rotten. A rotten tree cannot produce good fruit.
The English Standard uses a healthy tree and a diseased tree.
Okay, a healthy tree and a diseased tree. If a tree is diseased, then the fruit's going to be what? The fruit's going to be diseased. The fruit's going to be rotten. The fruit is not going to be good. It's going to be evil. And eventually, his actions are going to reveal him to be what he truly is.
It's a little bit like, the fig tree that Jesus cursed. It looked like it was a good tree until he got there and it had no fruit.
And it had no fruit. Yeah. And it had no fruit. And so he cursed it, didn't he? All right.
Yes, ESV says a disease tree.
Okay, a diseased tree. And so a diseased tree, a corrupt tree, a bad tree is not going to produce good fruit. And so eventually we're going to know him by the actions that he lives by. But Dave said something a little bit ago that makes a whole lot of sense to me. How can we know he is a false teacher if we don't know what the truth really is?
We won't.
We won't.
I think that's the biggest problem in the religious world.
Yeah.
People don't know the truth.
Don't know the truth. That's what makes me wonder about the congregation in Tennessee. How many of them really knew the truth?
It seems like they don't want to know.
And it seems like they don't want to know. Okay, well, the preacher said this, the elders made this decision, it must be all right. We've got to know the truth. Turn to 2 Timothy. 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 15. 2 Timothy 2 and 15. Now, I was going to read to you out of a different translation, but I left it on my desk. I was going to read to you off my phone.
What translation?
New English translation. New English translation, I think, huh?
I need to invest in that.
You don't have the New English translation?
I got easy to read.
I like the new English.
You got it, Jan? Jan's got it.
Okay.
Oh, there you go. Oh, lifesaver.
Yep, New English translation. Okay. Study to show thyself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. Study or be diligent. What does it mean to be diligent?
To keep working at it.
Okay, to keep working at it, to be constantly at a thing. Okay, so be diligent to show thyself approved unto God. What is one way that we can show ourselves approved unto him?
Studying and knowing his word.
Studying and knowing his word. Getting to know what the word truly has to say. So study or be diligent to show thyself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. That phrase, rightly dividing the word of truth, carries with it what idea?
What does that mean?
Yeah. What does it mean?
Rightly handling the word.
Rightly handling the word of truth. Okay, rightly handling. All right, so we need to know that things are of the Old Testament or of the New Testament. Is that all?
No.
We've also got to understand how to teach the word correctly.
Yeah, Steve Reed says one who applies the true teaching in the right way.
In the right way. All right, now here is the New English translation. Verse 15. Make every effort to present yourself before God as a proven worker who does not need to be ashamed, teaching the message of truth accurately. So in order for us to teach it accurately, we've got to what?
Know it.
We've got to know it. We've got to have a knowledge of it accurately. Okay. Now let's go on down through there. And I'm going to continue reading in the New English translation. But avoid profane chatter, because those occupied with it will stray further and further into ungodliness. And their message will spread its infection like gangrene, which is the idea behind the word canker in verse 17 in the King James. Okay, and so their message is going to spread like an infection. It's going to spread like gangrene. What message? Well, let's go on. Their message will spread its infection like gangrene, hymitis, and pertussis, are in this group. What group do you think they're in? They're going to be in a group of false teachers. Okay, let's go on to verse 18. They have strayed from the truth. By saying that the resurrection has already occurred, they are undermining some people's faith. They are undermining some people's faith. And so there was false teachers in that day. And we've got to study, we've got to have a knowledge in order to know that what they are teaching is false. So we can know them. We can identify them. We'll know them by their works. And if we study and have a knowledge of God's Word, we'll be able to see and know that they are not teaching correctly. They're not teaching correctly. All right, we're going to end there tonight, friends. We want to extend the invitation. If we have anyone here this evening who needs to come in obedience to the gospel, needs to make things right, why not come right now while together we stand?